Good morning, everybody. I wanted to welcome you back after the Labor Day weekend. Today we're going to start building the taxonomy that was presented by Dr. Gentile and her colleagues over a period of many years. As I said the other day in class, the first presentation was in 1972 when Ann Gentile presented a paper in Quest, which I refer to later in this presentation, where she talks about open and closed skills. Later on in 1975 and then again in 2000, she updates the taxonomy with greater elaboration, and I will discuss this as we continue our discussion of the taxonomy over the next several weeks. So the first thing that I wanted to remind you of is that a taxonomy is a system for classifying things. Gentile classified motor skills according to the body and the interaction of the body with the environment. So there are two main categories into which Gentile discusses skills. The first being how the body is interacting with the environment, and then what the environment looks like and how that's going to dictate how our body moves. So to begin our journey, in 1957, Poulton is a man from England. He conceptualized motor skills based upon whether they were predictable before the movement began or whether there was a lot of unpredictability about the environment. He categorized these skills into one of two discrete categories. When I say discrete categories, I mean that something fits into one category or the other category, but there is no overlap between the categories. In other words, they are discrete from one another. These categories were referred to as open and closed skills by Poulton. According to Poulton, an open skill is one where the relevant factors in the environment are moving. In other words, in an open skill, the ball or object cannot be predicted until it is in motion, and then its parameters, the speed, the spin, the direction, can be anticipated. Expertise affects how and when these predictions are made about these regulatory or relevant features in the environment. For open skills, we have to wait a little bit longer to understand how the object or the ball is moving in the environment in order to be able to make predictions about where it's going to be. A closed skill, according to Poulton, is one where the relevant factors or the regulatory factors in the environment are predictable prior to stimulus onset. So an example of an open skill would be batting in a baseball game. The relevant or regulatory factors related to the pitch in baseball are unknown to the batter until the ball is released from the pitcher's hand and the batter can pick up information about the ball and, again, its movement direction, its movement speed, its spin, and so forth. In a closed skill, for example, batting off a tee, notice that what we've changed in this environment is the moving object. In a closed skill, notice as batting off a tee, the ball is stationary until the person swings and hits it. At that point, it's out of the performer's control. So a closed skill is one in which the relevant factors in the environment are predictable prior to the time that the stimulus occurs. So remember our very simple information processing model from the other day. I want you to think about these open and closed skills and consider how central processing might be affected by whether a skill is open or closed. Note that in a closed skill, I could predict the relevant factors of the environment, where the ball is going to be, or the object is going to be, It's not moving, so I could predict this earlier in time and thus take some of the emphasis off of central processing, because before the stimulus even begins at input, I could actually begin the central processing. In other words, perceive what the environment looks like, make a decision about what I'm going to do. In other words, I'm going to hit the ball off the tee to third base. And the effector process, how I'm going to do that. How am I going to organize this response? And then finally, output would be, what does it look like? What is the process of movement? Remember, we talked about the movement process. In other words, how does my gait look? What does my swing in the baseball swing look like, batting swing? And what's the product? Did I actually hit the ball down third base? Notice that in open skills, we have to wait for the input, whether it's internal or external stimuli, and thus we can't begin our central processing until this stimulus occurs, and thus we then can predict what that environment's going to look like. Again, once we've gone through this central processing, then we have output, which would be the movement process, what it looks like in the output, and what the product of the movement is. Did you achieve the goal? One of Poulton's students, Barbara Knapp, conceived of open and closed skills in a different way than Poulton. What Knapp discussed was a continuum of open and closed skills. In other words, a continuum has many places where a skill could fit rather than the discrete categories that were first proposed by Poulton. So the level of expertise of a particular performer will actually determine where that person's skill is on the continuum of open and closed skills. So on this slide, you can actually see the continuum. Notice that a person could fit anywhere on this continuum. So what I have done is I've actually placed into the continuum the basketball foul shot for a novice. Notice that it is a closed skill. All of the environmental characteristics, the ball, the basket, etc., are all stationary. Notice that this skill, no matter what, will always remain on the closed side of the continuum, because the question we're going to ask is, are the relevant factors in the environment stationary or moving? If they're stationary, it's going to be a closed skill. If they're moving, it's going to be an open skill. Notice where the basketball foul shot is placed for the expert. Notice that the expert is more habitual in terms of his or her response. In other words, when I do the basketball foul shot, every time I come up to the line, I look pretty much the same. I'm going to try to manufacture the motor program, the output, to be almost the same each time so that I am successful at meeting the goal of the task. Novices will have more motor programs that they'll attempt until they become better at doing the foul shot. Notice here that I've placed dribbling on the continuum. Notice in this particular case, dribbling by an expert moves closer to the closed side of the continuum, but what I do want you to notice is that it never cuts across the center of the continuum to become a closed skill. Why is dribbling against a defender an open skill? Because the offender, the person dribbling, has to read the characteristics of the ball, where it's going to be, how fast it's going to come back to my hand, how slow it will return to my hand. And also there is a defender, and that defender is going to be somewhat unpredictable and also moving. So notice the characteristics that change between the expert player and the novice player are that the expert is better in picking up characteristics of the environment, the regulatory features or relevant features of the environment, better than the novice individual. Notice that Knapp added to the continuum the words habitual and perceptual. Habit, notice the word habit in habitual, means that you develop some kind of habit strength. Remember I said in the basketball foul shot, I'm going to attempt to repeat the same motor pattern over and over and over again, because if I'm successful, then I should expect to be successful each time I do that task in the same motor pattern. And so I become habitual in that motor pattern. But when I'm dribbling against the defender, I can't become habitual because the defender is going to change up as much as he or she can, and thus putting more emphasis on the perceptual process. And notice that in the last slide, I talked about the emphasis on perception, decision, and effector in open skills after the stimulus occurs, whereas in closed skills, we could focus on what the relevant perception, decision, and effector are before the stimulus actually occurs. So how did Gentile actually contribute to this taxonomy? Again, in 1972, 1975, 1987, and in 2000, Gentile and her colleagues defined open skills as those where the relevant factors in the environment are moving, and closed skills as those where the relevant factors in the environment are stationary. Gentile considers open and closed skills as discrete categories. We need to do this in order to be able to use our full taxonomy. However, I want you to understand Knapp's conception related to the continuum of open and closed skills. An open skill is externally paced. In other words, I am not free to begin or end the open skill until the stimuli actually, or the stimulus actually governs the way I'm going to move in response to the environment. Whereas in a closed skill, this is self-paced. In other words, when I go up to the batting tee, within a certain period of time, maybe 5 seconds, 10 seconds, whatever the rule is, and by the way, that rule is an arbitrary rule. But when that rule basically says time is up, within those 10 seconds, I am free to begin the movement whenever I see fit. Whereas with a regularly pitched object, I have to respond to the pace of the object rather than saying, well, I don't feel like hitting that right now unless I want to take a ball or take a strike. So there are 4 important questions that we're going to discuss in relation to Gentile's whole taxonomy, and I will make sure that all 4 questions are within the presentations that we have. The first question related to open and closed skills is, are the relevant factors in the environment stationary or moving? If they're stationary, then it's a closed skill. If they're moving, it's an open skill. Here's a copy, or the front page actually, of the original article that was published by Gentile in 1972. It's called A Working Model of Skill Acquisition with Application to Teaching, and here is where she discusses the differences between open and closed skills and all of the things that she sees as important in the discussion of open and closed skills. Notice here it's 1972, published in the journal Quest, and you are able to get a full text PDF of this article. So here you see some funny clip art, And I want you to notice on the left you have a basketball player who's dribbling, and certainly that basketball player is involved in an open task because it's a dribbling task. Where the tennis player, note that he's doing a forearm stroke and thus, or forehand stroke, and thus it's an open skill because at no time during the tennis game, with the exception of the serve, are you involved in a closed skill. We could argue, too, that the serve is an open skill because the ball is tossed, and thus the ball is in motion, and therefore the regulatory factors of the environment are moving. I want you to notice something about the clip art here. You have an African American, apparently, who is playing basketball, and a white American, apparently, playing tennis. And clip art is quite well known for being racist, putting African Americans in sports that you might see them in for certain reasons, not because African Americans are not good at tennis and they're only good at basketball, but rather you might see more African American people playing basketball because of class differences. Obviously, tennis costs a lot more money to play than basketball, and this might contribute to some of the differences. Clip art, however, contributes to our perception of race in the sense of pigeonholing certain people into certain sports and other people into other sports. Of course, we could say that there's an exception to this with the greatest athlete of all time, Serena Williams, who is, of course, a master tennis player and also a champion. So I want you to go out, please, and see these YouTube videos and just watch them and think to yourself, oh, wow, that's an open skill because of this, and that's a closed skill because of whatever. So I have some real videos here where you can actually observe basketball playing and other sports that are open skills. Closed skills. Oh, here's an open skill. Californians with your crazy sports. Here's a dog on a wakeboard. This would be an open skill because you can see how the water's moving. There's a wake there. Those of us who have skied before, you know that if you have a calm lake, the wake is easy. You can go out of the wake. But certainly the wake that is represented here by the trail of the boat changes all the time. And so we have to read those changes in order not to fall over. And here you see a picture of San Jose State University from the year 2001. Obviously, this would be an open skill for both athletes because both athletes are moving. They have to consider each other's movements here, and also the ball is moving, and thus it's an open skill. In football, certainly, when somebody is coming to tackle you, you want to try to stay out of that person's way. The relevant stimulus here, or the regulatory factors in the environment here, would be your defensive player, and thus the offender right here would be involved in an open skill there. And finally, catching would be an example of an open skill because the ball is in motion and you have to predict the relative speed, spin, direction of the ball. These are called the parameters with which the ball is moving. Closed skills, on the other hand, would be skills where the regulatory factors in the environment are stationary. Notice that in the hurdles, as well as in the high jump, you have examples of closed skills. Yes, the performer is moving, but the relevant factors in the environment are stationary unless, as a result of the performer's skill, they touch the bar or touch the hurdle and then it falls over, and then you might actually have an open skill situation because when the hurdler comes down, he or she wants to look out for the hurdle. but generally hurdles is considered a closed skill. Please go out to these videos again, very important videos, and watch these closed skills and how the performers self-pace their movements. Of course, up in the mountains, we could finish our hike or our bicycle ride, and after the ride, we're just going to sit down and enjoy a juice, and you can, or an iced tea. I know that some of you might enjoy some other things, but for this class, we're just going to enjoy some non-alcoholic beverages. At any rate, you can see that everything is closed here. Nothing is moving in the environment that's important to this performer, and thus he's involved in closed skills. And finally, in powerlifting, this is a student of ours, Zach, who was a champion in powerlifting for our intramural team. They travel all over the country. This was from 2013. Obviously, Zach is putting the bar into motion. Zach is moving the bar himself, and thus he's involved in a closed skill. If he loses control of the bar and the weights, then in fact he may be involved in an open skill. We're going to come back to class on Thursday, and we'll be discussing open and closed skills again, and we'll start adding to the continuum. I'll see you all in lab later today, or I'll see you on Thursday in class. Have a great week, everybody.